And yeah, and just a reminder, please, if you haven't, to mute. So, okay, we're looking again, page 1005, verse 23. It's 23 of chapter 3, and we'll shortly be in chapter 4. And here Moses is going to repeat something, the story that he already told in the book of Deuteronomy. But here I think it's going to be a little bit different, right? Et Hanan, and of course that's the name of the parsha, because the name of the parsha is the first significant word, just as the name of the books of the Torah are the first significant word. The Et Hanan, and that's how you find it, by the way. If you're a Torah reader and you want to find the parsha, you look for the first significant word, and in this case, when you see the Et Hanan, you know that's where you're going to start. All right, so the Et Hanan, and I pleaded, right? And the root here is Hanun, right? Merciful. God is Hanun v'rachum. God is merciful and compassionate. So I asked for mercy from God at that time, and I said, and here we get this plea. He says, Adonai Elohim, O Lord God, you who let your servants see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand, right? And here, it particularly, Yadcha chazaka, your mighty hand. This reminds us immediately of the Exodus from Egypt, right? That God took us from Egypt with an mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So Moses is saying to God, you let me see the first works of your greatness, and there'll be more, right? And he goes on to say, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal, right? You are like no other God. Now, from the point of view of Deuteronomy, there are another gods, right? There are those who are ascribed to be God, but in fact, one of the major themes of this book is they're not gods. Only Adonai, only the God of Israel is truly God. There may be, and we see this in other books in the Torah, there may be other beings, angelic beings, associated even with other nations, but you are the only God, and no other heavenly being is like you. And now he makes this plea. He says to God, and one other thing, the Yad Chazaka, your mighty hand, becomes the name. Often works of Jewish law, commentaries, and so on, are often named after a phrase in the Torah itself. Maimonides' code of Jewish law is called the Mishnah Torah, meaning Torah, and it's really a phrase we see in Deuteronomy. Yad Chazakah, and if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law, part of it is called the Yad Chazakah, one section of it. At any rate, I've seen your mighty hand, there's none like you, and now he says, Everana the et haaretz, let me go. And this is Moses pleading, let me go and see the good land, let me pass over the Jordan. In other words, let me see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, the good mountain of Lebanon, right? So here again, Moses has been told he won't go into the promised land, but now we get another perspective, which is Moses pleaded with God. He didn't just accept God's verdict. It was therefore obviously a source of great pain and disappointment to him after all that he had gone through. And he said, I pleaded with God, right? I wanted to go. And I think part of this, he's talking to this generation who will go without him. So I didn't want to abandon you, right? I wanted to go. What is right? Vayitaber Adonai, and God was angry with me. Right? So God did not welcome Moses's pleas here. There were other times when Moses was pleading for the people, right? When God wanted to punish them, destroy them, wipe them out, and Moses was the intercessor. When it came to the people, Moses's prayers are accepted, but here God will have none of it. And in fact, God is impatient with Moses. God is angry with Moses. The other place that you see this kind of a response from God a little bit is at the beginning of the book of Exodus, all the way back when God is sending Moses on his mission, telling him that he should go to Pharaoh at the burning bush, and he makes a series of arguments why he isn't the right person, and he tells Moses that he's going to go and he'll be doing this. I'm just looking for the exact language where he says what he says. And let me find it. Comes to, yeah, here he is. He's got the burning bush. And God says to him, I've heard what the people are doing. And Moses says, how, what if they don't believe me? And so on. And Moses is still not convinced, and he's pleading with God that he should send someone else. And ultimately, we see God becoming, I'm not finding it, God becoming quite angry with Moses after allowing him to have his brother go with him and to be his spokesman, because Moses said that he is not a man of words. And finally, God says essentially enough. I've heard your pleas, and it's enough, right? And that kind of impatience and anger shown by God at the beginning of Moses's mission, we're beginning to see here as well. Anyway, the word yitaber, right? God was angry. If you look back to the beginning of verse 25 in the Hebrew, ebrana, right? Let me pass over. It's the same root, right? Ayin bet resh. So there's a kind of linguistic play here. Moses says, let me pass over over the Jordan. And God's response, right? God's anger in some ways reflects Moses's, in some ways, audacity in asking for this. But God is not, as we'll see, completely insensitive to Moses's request. God was angry with me on your account. And we saw this was the last time Moses introduced this. And Moses said, he doesn't emphasize his own sin. He says it was because of you. And v'lo shama Eli, and God would not listen to me. The word shema, right? That's the word here, lo shama Eli, becomes a key word throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Shema means to hear, to listen, but it is far more than that. When we say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, right here, Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. It's not just saying, hey, listen. It's The classic English word is hearken, which is much more than listen. It's listen and obey. It's not quite the language of command, but it really implies far more than a passive act of listening. Listen attentively and be aware of the importance of what I'm telling you. Okay, and what does God say? What does Moses say that God said to him? V'yomer Adonai Eli, God said to me, Rav lach, right? It's enough, right? The word Rav lach or Rav lacha we've seen before. Remember that at the very beginning of the book, when Moses was talking about God telling the people that they should leave, he's reminding the people of this experience of where they left Sinai, they went into the wilderness. God said, Rav lach, right? You have stayed here too long, right? When Korach challenges Moses' authority in the wilderness, Rav lacha, you've taken too much on yourself, right? So here it's Rav lach, al tosef daber elai. Don't talk to me anymore. So I would translate here. It says enough. I would say in a more playful way, enough already. Right? It's enough already. But there is I came across in Rashi. He quotes a midrash, which I thought was really lovely. Rav is a lot, right? Rav means a great deal, right? It's Rav lacha, it's enough, it's too much, right? But he says Rav, it could be translated playfully, right? Midrashically, it's not the literal meaning. You have a lot. Rav lacha, you have a great deal. In other words, I've given you a great deal. You are Moses. Right? You will live for all times. You are the lawgiver, the law receiver, all of that, right? So don't ask for more, because you really have a lot. Appreciate. That's the midrash, right? Appreciate what you have. And I thought it was a really interesting reading. Okay, so he says, Al tosef daber elai, don't speak to me anymore about this matter. And then he says, right, go up to the summit of Pisgah, up to this mountaintop, gaze around to the west, the north, the south, and the east. Look at it well, you will not go across the Jordan. So what is God essentially saying to Moses? I'll give you part of what you want. Right? What did Moses say? Let me pass over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan. Right? That's the request. So what is God saying? Essentially, you won't pass over, but you will see. Right? This is God's concession to Moses. You get to see the promised land. You'll see the place you've been traveling to, the place you have struggled to bring the people to. And in fact, if you look carefully at the language, what God is telling Moses, he's going to give him visually a great deal more than Moses asked for, right? What did Moses say? Moses said, let me see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, the hill country, the Lebanon. In other words, let me see, I'll go up and I'll look across and I'll see the land. But what God is saying is you'll go up and you'll look to the west, the north, the south, and the east, and you won't go across the Jordan, right? You will see essentially the entire land of Israel, not just what a person could see from the mountaintop. And what we have here is this suggestion that Moses is going to have an almost superhuman experience, that he is going to be able to see everything. And this is part of God's gift to him. So first, God is going to let him have part of his wish. And in fact, more than that, God is going to give him a glimpse of the whole land. So the Midrash has lots of fun with this, right? How can a human being see more than what, they didn't have drones, right? Figure if there was a drone, he could manage it, but they don't have drones. And so they go back to, the Midrash goes back to an interesting problem in the book of Genesis. Right? What does God create on the first day? Light, right? That's the first thing God creates. But if you come to the fourth day, then you get the sun, the moon, and the stars. So what's that light from the first day? Because the only light we know, other than fire, of course, man-made light, is the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars. So the Midrash is that God took this special light and hid it away for the righteous, that the righteous will eventually be able to enjoy the light of the first day of creation. And the Midrash is based around a verse, which you may know if you know the Friday night service. It's a verse from Psalms, or Zarua la Tzaddik, right? Light is stored up for the righteous. So taking that verse from Psalms very literally, they create this Midrash, that it is this primal light, primordial light of creation that God will give Moses, so that Moses will be able to see, will be able to receive at least part of his plea and see the promised land. Okay, but as we see, Moses says, God says, you won't go across the Jordan. Give Joshua his instructions and imbue him with strength and courage, for he will go across at the head of his people, and he will allocate the land that you may only see. So it's not your role, but you actually have a role to play. This idea that you should give Joshua strength and courage, right? And later we're going to see in the book of Joshua, you see this again and again, chazak b'amatz, be strong and be of courage, right? Joshua needs Moses's mentorship if he is to be able to do his job. And inherent here is a sense you have a role to play in the future. Right? You can take all that you know, and just as Moses will pass on this long speech, which will inspire future generations, you are training essentially the next leader, and you will give him strength and courage and reassurance that he is up to the task. And meanwhile, Moses says, when all this was going on, when I was saying that I wanted to go into the promised land and God told me no, and all of that, they were in the valley near Beit Peor, this valley where terrible things happened, the people were apostatizing and so on. And we're going to see why that's important in a minute. Okay, before we go on now to chapter 4, I'm just going to change the view. And if you have any questions or comments up to this point, I'm happy to take them. If there are, yes, Saul.
Yeah, I was looking at the word Vayit Aber in 26, and Onkla is translated as ragaz, which is anger. So it's,
Yes.
they don't use the play on words. They just translate it very pashut,
Right.
anger.
It both are true, Saul, right? In other words, the Bible uses language on many levels. Certainly the meaning is that God was angry. But the Bible is very, I mean, the Torah is a literary document. And it does things again and again with a sensitivity to language. And so the use of Rav L'cha in different circumstances is one example of it. Listen to this at the beginning of Parshat Korach. V'yikach Korach ben Kahat, right? There's an alliteration in the language. So all of this, I'm just pointing out something which has nothing to do with meaning, but it's a piece of the literary style of the Torah itself. Good. Any other questions or comments okay, Hannah and then Sandy.
Yeah, I
Go
was also looking at that word, and I think, I know in Hebrew, avarion is a criminal. Yes,
Right.
and then
What,
is that the same one? Also, Avera in Rosh Hashanah, in
right,
Kippur,
so,
isn't
right,
that
so
connected?
Avera and our yon is not necessarily a criminal, right? But it's someone who does something bad.
Oh,
Avera is something bad. And all of this in Hebrew, linguistically, I think is tied to the word halacha. So halacha, which we often talk about, we translate as Jewish law, right? Actually means lalechet, right? To go. Halacha is a pathway, right? And if you stray from the path, right, then you are an avaryan. You are one who goes outside of the path. And then, by the way, what do you do in order to make up for these sins that use transgression? Listen to the English word, transgress, right? What do? Shuvah, you return. Return what? To the halacha, meaning to the path. Right? It's interesting, right? Because you have Tao, right? The idea, or Tao, it's sometimes pronounced, right? In Eastern religions, is the pathway the way that one should live one's life. Okay, good. Sandy.
So Rabbi, when you were talking about the light that was produced on the fourth
Yeah.
day, that reminded me, I don't know if this is right or not, of the Maimonides said, it was put into the nature of things like that the snake would talk. I mean, at twilight, there were 10
Right.
things, but other than that, and it was put into the nature of
Right.
the other things when they were created. So
Right.
was that, would
So,
you say
right.
that
So
was?
I think you're pointing to an interesting thing. What we really have, what I'm suggesting to you, though it's a midrash, is essentially mystical, right? To talk about a hidden light, which is going to be given to Moses, right? This is not a naturalistic idea. And Maimonides doesn't agree with it. Maimonides would call it Narishkeit, right? Because for Maimonides is a rationalist, right? And he was controversial in his day as a result, right? Maimonides believes that Judaism has to be squared with Western philosophy as he knows it in his day, and that's, we're talking about Plato, right? And Aristotle, particularly Aristotle, right? So for him, any kind of supernaturalism has to be read out, or at least following the Midrash in Avot, which you mentioned, say, well, it was a built-in exception, something like that. Okay. And Maimonides, in his book, The Guide to the Perplexed, it's all about that. It's all about how do we deal with these passages where God is said to have an arm and all this stuff. And he's writing a letter to his student, and he's trying to give him guidance as to, because as far as Maimonides is concerned, what Aristotle has to say about the world is right. And if the Torah is at variance, we're not understanding the Torah correctly. But this midrash about hidden light, that's not Maimonides. And by the way, it has nothing to do with Jewish law, right? The midrash is free to do all kinds of things very playfully, but they don't have legal implications. Okay, I might have seen one more hand. Okay, if not, so we're going to move on very slowly, and there's a great deal more to say as we get in now to chapter 4. Let me back to the speaker view. Okay, so chapter 4, Va'ata, now, right? He says, now, O Israel, and here Moses is speaking to them, right? He's addressing the people, is Israel. And then he says, Shema, again, we see it again and again, Shema, listen, pay attention. Here in the JPS translation is heed, right? The laws and the rules I am instructing you to observe. Why? Laman tichyu uvatem v'yirishtem et haaretz, that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you, right? In other words, these laws are actually for the land. And we're going to see that a lot of the laws that we'll see in the book of Deuteronomy have to do with the land. I was just listening to a brilliant lecture from a scholar at JTS about Spinoza. And Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish community. The lecture is about why it's really about censorship in the community. It's one of a series of lectures. And anyway, for what Spinoza says about Jewish law, he feels it's no longer applicable, and it was only given to the nation of Israel for their use when they became a nation and they had a land. And once they were exiled from the land, no longer relevant, doesn't matter to anyone, not important. But you can see why the Jewish community had problems with Spinoza. And that's not their only problem, right? But that idea that the laws are focused on the land and that they'll become a kind of constitution, legal guide for the people in the land, right? And their purpose is so that they may live in the land. We'll see that here. We see it again in the Shema, and we see it elsewhere as well. Okay, so, and then he says, right, your eyes have seen, you saw with your own eyes what God, oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping something, and something that I really want to spend some time talking about. Okay, so you need to do these things so you can live and go into the land. And then it says, this is verse 2 of chapter 4. Lo tosfu al hadavar asher anochi mitzavechem. Do not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away. Right? This is a mitzvah, which is known in shorthand as Baal Tosif. A person who adds to the Torah is a Baal Tosif, and it is forbidden by the Torah to do that. Now, how do we understand this? Because it seems like lots of stuff got added to the Torah over the years. We have lots of laws which are not in the Torah. It also says that you're not allowed to take away the laws in the Torah. And we know of examples where the laws in the Torah don't seem to apply anymore. Right? I mean, and I'm not just talking about sacrifice. Okay, so there are laws about sacrifice, but we can't sacrifice, right? But there are other laws, and I'll give you an example of one in a minute, where really we seem to have done away with them. So, in fact, there are a couple of them that just seem, so how do we understand this law? Now, one way to understand it, if you look at what follows, you saw with your own eyes what the Lord did in the matter of Baal Peor, that the Lord wiped out from among you every person who followed Baal Peor, while you who held fast to the Lord are alive today. In other words, what's the context? It's about idolatry. It's about idolatry. And so some people have argued, well, this is really limited to idolatry from the context. So it's not that you can't add or diminish the laws. It's really you can't follow other gods. You can't add or have less than the God you have. That's not very tenable, I think. It is suggested, but it doesn't really fit the language here, and it's generally rejected. So what do we do with this? And what I want to do is to share with you how the Jewish tradition has taken this principle of not adding and not subtracting and squaring it with a great deal of other things. So one way to do it has to do with numbers, right? So we're told on Sukkot that we are to take 4 species, right? The palm and the myrtle and the willow and the etrog, right? And we're supposed to wave. So what if you want to add a rose? It would be pretty. Not only will I have these 4, but nope, that's adding. You're not allowed to do that. Supposed to put tzitzit on the 4 corners of your garments. What if you want to add another fringe to your talit, right? No, you can't do it. You're supposed to, according to the rabbis, have 4 passages in, for biblical text when you put on tefillin, you only want 3 or you want 5, right? So that's one way to look. Or there's even, what if you're a priest and you want to bless the people? That's your job, actually. And, in Orthodox congregations, routinely, and in some conservative congregations, when the Amidah is repeated and on the high holidays or on holidays, right, the priests come forward and there's a ritual where they bless the people using the words in the Torah, because as we saw some of us last year, when we looked at the book of Numbers, it says, Ko tivarchu, thus you shall bless the people of Israel, God speaking to the priests. Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, right? May the Lord bless you and keep you, and so on, right? What if you want to add your own blessing? Right? You do the 3 in the Torah, and then you say, and I hope and may God give you a good year. Right? You're doing this on the high holidays. No, that's adding, right? And if you only want to do 2, no, you can't do it, right? So that's one approach. A second approach, and these all exist simultaneously, right? A second approach is you can't add to the law, but you can take the existing law and you can develop it, right? You're not adding independent laws, but you're finding things in the law. So it says, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. How do we do that, right? I could come up with a variety of laws which would be consistent with the commandment to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So, for example, can I use a cell phone on Shabbat? Right? Now, never up till the modern times have we had this issue, right? Telephones, not less cell phones, right? But we could say the halakha forbids, right? Am I making a new law? If somebody is on life support and they're brain dead, can I turn off the machines? Well, the Torah tells us, right, that I've put before you life and death, therefore choose life. Right? Can I take that injunction and actually create new law, which will say it's either prohibited or permitted, right? So you can see how even very novel things within the framework of existing law you could find a way of saying they're not really additions. Then you have the whole idea of what's called siag la Torah, building a fence around the law. We see this first, this idea in Pirkei Avot, in the wisdom of the fathers, a section of the Mishnah largely about ethics, but it talks about the chain of transmission. Moses received the Torah from God, he passes it on to Joshua to the prophets, and so on, until they come to a body which is known as the Great Assembly. And then it says, and they said the following things, the Great Assembly. These are traditions now that were passed down. And one of the 3 things that they say is make a fence around the Torah. But this is a tradition, according to this, going all the way back to Sinai. What does it mean to make a fence around the Torah? It means create prohibitions that will keep people from doing something prohibited. Right? In other words, these are things that are actually not prohibited by the Torah itself. But if I create it, I'll keep you from violating the Torah. Classic example. Can I pick up a pen on Shabbat? There's nothing inherently violating Shabbat. I can pick up objects on Shabbat. But if I pick it up and I have it in my hand, I might inadvertently write with it, right? So according to rabbinic law, I shouldn't pick it up at all. It's a violation of Shabbat, right? But that's not inherent in the laws of Shabbat. But it is a way of preserving Shabbat. And there are lots of these siyagim. I'll mention one other thing in this regard, just because I've always found it interesting. So back in the book of Genesis, God tells Adam that he can't eat from the tree in the garden. And then later on, the snake is talking to Eve, and he says, well, what did God say? And Eve says, well, he said we can't touch it and we can't eat from it. So the question is, where does she get this idea that couldn't touch it? It's not what God said. So the Midrash says, oh, well, this was a siyag. Adam thought, if I tell her she can't touch it, then she won't eat from it. Right? Makes sense, except according to the Midrash, then the snake pushes her into the tree. And he says, look, nothing happened to you, right? Right. The Midrash is really saying, in a sense, be careful about this. Right? If you make too many fences, people may actually come to violate the law itself. So be careful when you do it. But this idea of a siyag la Torah, right, a fence around the law, becomes a way of extending or setting aside this idea of Bal Tosif, that you can't add. Now, another classic way to do this, and particularly where it's not only don't add, but don't subtract, is through interpretation. And there are lots of examples of this, right? For example, we have a law which is deeply troubling, right? It says if you have a stubborn and rebellious child, and he doesn't listen, and he's a drunk and a glutton and so on, you should bring him before a court. And if they agree, he can be put to death, should be put to death. Now that sounds outrageous. And it was to the rabbis at the time of the Talmud outrageous. They couldn't imagine that Jews would actually do this. But it's a law in the Torah. So what do? They essentially interpret it out of existence. They can't cancel it. That would be a violation of this principle that you can't diminish the number. So what do they say? Well, it says he's a child that does not listen to his father and his mother. So they say, you know what? What this means is that his father and his mother's voices have to be identical, based on the use of the singular and the plural in the verse itself, right? So if his father has a deep voice and his mother has a high voice, no. If he can distinguish between who's calling me, if he knows it's his father, not his mother, doesn't apply. It says he's a child. Well, if he's really a child, then laws don't apply to him. But if he's an adult, then why is he called a child? Well, he's between 12 and a half and 13 years old, right? And they go on like this until finally one of the rabbis says, there never was, there never will be a child who is a stubborn and rebellious child who is to be put to death, right? So no, they don't remove a law from the Torah. Their technique is to say, of course that's a law, of course we have to follow it, but the circumstances in which we apply it are so narrow that in fact, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist. Another way to approach this problem is to say it's really directed at individuals, not at the community. In other words, the community and the rabbis, if it's accepted by people, can legislate, but an individual may not add or subtract from the law. And then I wanted to share with you in particular something that I found in the Talmud, which I think is really, really quite interesting. So I'm going to share my screen with you at this point. I hope. There we go. Okay. So if you look at, let me put you guys down. So why is this not hiding? There we go. Okay. So this comes from the Talmud in the tractate Megillah, and we're going to see why it's there in a second. So the sages taught 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people, and they neither subtracted nor added onto what is written in the Torah, right? That's our law. And these prophets who are speaking God's word, they're after Moses, and once we're past Moses, we have this law, except for the reading of the Megillah, right? So the reading of the Megillah actually comes after the Torah, right? It's much later, and how can we say that there's a mitzvah on Purim to read the Megillah? And so these prophets and prophetesses did make an exception for the Megillah, which they said, like an additional law that has to be read, has to be added for all future generations. So how did they do that? On what basis did they add it? Rabbi Chia bar Avid said that Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha said they reasoned as follows. If, when recalling the Exodus from Egypt, in which the Jews were delivered from slavery to freedom, we recite songs of praise, right? The Song of the Sea, the hymns of Hallel, in order to properly recall the miracle of Purim and commemorate God's delivering us from death to life, is it not all the more so the case that we must sing God's praises by reading the story of the Megillah, right? So it's not exactly an existing law, right? But we can derive from that law, from the way the Torah approaches something, a kind of permission to do this. And so the Talmud then goes on to ask, I'll just share this with you, though it's not quite relevant. If so, our obligation should be at least as great when we recall the Exodus from Egypt. And not only that, let us recite Hallel on Purim. And the Gemara says, Hallel is not said on, because Hallel is not recited on a miracle that happened outside the land of Israel, right? So we only say Hallel in celebration of something that happened in the land of Israel. And the Gemara goes on to say, well, what about the Exodus? That too took place outside the land of Israel. And then it goes on and it tries to analyze that. I'm going to stop my screen sharing at this point. I've spent quite a bit of time on this just because I find it absolutely fascinating. So I want to open it up now for questions on this mitzvah of you shall not add, nor shall you subtract. I'm just changing my view. Okay, have at it. Saul, you're first.
What you just said about the Exodus from Egypt, why they weren't in the promised land, they were in Egypt, so they're still doing Hallel.
Yeah, that's the question. Why do we say Hallel on Pesach? We don't say Hallel on Purim, right?
Yeah.
And in some sense, you could say, well, the reading of the Megillah replaces Hallel, but because it's outside the land of Israel, but in the land of Israel, but the Exodus was outside the land of Israel also. And then the rabbis go back and forth. Eventually they say, well, this was before the giving of the Torah, the rules were different. That's how they deal with it. Yeah, Marilyn.
In later years, when the rabbis are interpreting these statements, do they make changes?
Yes, they certainly do make changes. But as I was trying to explain before, they do it in a way that they can say that they're not really eliminating the law and they're not really adding to it. They're doing it through interpretation. They're going to ground whatever they do either to eliminate something by interpreting it out of existence or by adding something to say it's implicit in an existing legal text. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Francesca.
I get a little lower in my hand. So what I was thinking about, this is very time. Oh, did I lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, good. I don't know what happened to my camera. Let's see if this is,
Don't worry about
okay,
it.
there I am. Okay. Push the wrong button. So it's interesting that you're reading, we're talking about this, about the importance about recounting the story of Purim, because in the Times today, they were talking about what happens. We are losing people who were still alive during the time of the Holocaust and World War. And what's going to happen when there's no one who has personal, direct recollection? Could this set up in another World War III, was what they were talking about. And I think the same thing with Purim and all the Holocaust studies and all the things that we do to remember different periods of time that we say never again. And if the memory is lost because it's not, the information isn't being transmitted, we could be at risk for some other heart development.
Right, and that is a big problem, right? And the Torah actually, the only sort of solution to that problem is something that we will see in a few verses, but I'm going to go to it now because we're going to run out of time. If you look at verse 9, this is on page 1008, but take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously that you do not forget the things you saw with your own eyes, so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and your children's children, right? So that's the solution of the Torah, that we pass it on. We know this with the Exodus, we have the Seder, we know it with Purim, where we every year read the story from the Megillah. And this is a subject that it's a big subject, and I wasn't going to enter into it, and I'm going to just mention it. We have examples of things that do really seem to be new laws, and they've been somewhat controversial as a result. And they are the two modern holidays, right, of Yom HaAtzmaut, of Israel Independence Day, which is treated, at least in some communities, but not in others, as a full holiday. A day on which you say Hallel, right? A day on which you read Torah, right? And the same thing is true of Yom HaShoah, right? The commemoration of the Holocaust, which is treated as, where we add things to the liturgy on that day and so on. Now, how we get to do that and whether we have the right to do that really runs up against this problem of not adding in a very dramatic way. And it's not just something the rabbis way back when did. It's something that we in our time, and we, those of us who are old enough, right? But certainly we're done in the 20th century, right? So, but it's all about, Francesca, the problem that you're raising, really. And the only solution is, just as Moses says to the people here, you've seen it, you have to pass it on to, and in some ways, this whole long speech of Moses, this book of Deuteronomy, is an attempt to do just that. Right? As Moses is recounting past events, reminding them of laws, all of this is meant to carry them to a time when the Exodus will be forgotten. And I'll take that one step further. If you think about the Passover Seder and the purpose of the Passover Seder, and it has several purposes. One of them is, in fact, on that day when your child asks, tell them about the Exodus from Egypt. So you're transmitting, but it's even more than that. We have the statement in the Haggadah, right? In every generation, a person should see themselves as if they personally went out of Egypt. The Seder is an attempt not just to recall, but in some deep sense to re-experience, to put yourself in their shoes, to feel like what it felt like to leave Egypt. And we do that symbolically, right? We eat the matzah that they ate and so on, right? But all of this is about the problem of maintaining historical memory.
Exactly.
And it's very hard. We read about things Jewish communities did years ago. We don't do them anymore. There were fast days which existed. If you look at, there's a book in a classic rabbinic work which is about fasting, and it lists the days on which you fast, and we don't even know what those days were. There are already in our own time, certain fasts are disappearing. There's a fast on the day after Rosh Hashanah, which is called Tzom Gedalia, or the Gedalia fast. How many people ever heard of Gedalia? Gedalia was a Jewish ruler in Judea under the Romans who was assassinated, right? So it's very easy for things to get lost, but there are certain monumental events. I mean, just think about the importance right now of remembering the circumstances of the creation of the state of Israel. How important that is for us as a Jewish community in a world that is increasingly trying to deny the legitimacy of that state, right? We cannot forget those events, right? And not to mention the Torah, which says, and we just read it, this land which I am giving you, the land which I promised to you. Right? So thank you for raising it. It's a very profound, it's an important question. And as I said, it's right here, that problem in our text. I have room for just like one more question if somebody has one, so I'll go ahead.
Yeah, getting back to do not add or do not subtract. I don't think this is relevant, but maybe maybe you would know. Sometimes in the Torah and in the Tanakh, some words are written properly, and the Ketib is different than the actual
Yes.
writing. Is that a
No, I don't
Where does-
think so. The rabbis, for a variety of reasons, don't want to read the Torah as it's written. It's not because they think it's not written that way, but there's a list of these places. It's actually, I think it's in. I know where it is in Maimonides' code, but I think it's in the Talmud as well. There's a list of these places where you should read what's written. I can think of one example where it seems to be cursing God, and we don't want to curse God, so we use a euphemism, right? There are a variety of places for different reasons but the important thing is, right, we're not changing the text, right? We're not erasing the Torah and writing something in. And I would go further than that. We now know probably that some of the passages in the Torah, small things, a word here or there, may indeed not be what was originally in the Torah. We know this on the basis of ancient translations of the Torah, on the basis of texts that were found in the Dead Sea, and so on. No one is suggesting that we should cross out what's there and write in what we believe to have been there, right? The Torah text as we have it, there are books, there are volumes where you can look at variations and why it was this way here and this way there, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls it says this and the Torah says that. But we're not changing it, right? We have to have a fealty to the text as we've received it. Okay, on that note, I want to tell you we're meeting again next week, and I hope you'll join. I want to again remind you of my podcast and encourage you to listen. I'm about to do one I'm kind of excited about. It'll be done next Monday. It'll be released the end of next week with my friend, the Episcopal priest, because I'm really interested. I'm going to talk about Hanukkah and he's going to talk about Christmas. And I realized that I know a lot about Christmas from popular culture. I don't know very much about Christmas, actually, as it's lived and practiced by Christians, faithful Christians. And I suspect he doesn't know very much about Hanukkah at all. So this is going to be an opportunity for us to explore that. I think you might find it interesting. So I would encourage you to check it out. All the podcasts, that one again will come out in about a little more than a week. One other thing I want to mention, Sandy, who is on our screen here, has been taking a class in Pirkei Avot, which she really likes. And she mentioned to me, and she's actually suggested to people in that class, they might like this class. And I feel like if you're interested, it's about this section of the Talmud. There is a fee for it. It's not a big fee. If it's something that you would be interested in, you can contact Sandy and she can give you that information. And Sandy, you want to just tell us your email?
Yeah, it's Sandra Lynn, SandraLynn 526 @AOL.com.
Okay, so Sandra Lynn 526 @AOL. And if you do want to do it, and you didn't write that down, the recording will go out. You can even shift to the very end of the recording and you'll be able to find it if it's something that you're interested in.
When is
Okay.
the class?
What is that class?
The class, it's going to start again in January. I think it's going to be on Thursday evening for 2 hours for 6 weeks. But I'm not 100% sure, but I can find out for you, Francesca.
You can be in touch with, if it's something you're interested in, it can be in touch. You can be in touch with
Yeah.
Sandy and she will update you about that.
It's
Okay.
an excellent course. I recommend it.
So great, and it's just noon, so I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Have a great week. As you noticed, we went very, very slowly today. I make no apologies for that. This is incredibly rich material, and this class is really about depth and not breadth. So stick with it. See you next week. Have a great
Thank
week.
you.
Thank
Great
you,
class as
Rabbi.
always.